The maitre d' barely glanced at me before shaking his head. "I'm sorry, madam, but there's no reservation under your name." I blinked, momentarily thrown off. "That's impossible. I was invited to dinner with my husband's family. They should already be here." He gave me a polite but firm smile. "I just checked. There's a reservation for 6 under Morgan Sinclair, but I'm afraid—" A sharp, familiar voice cut through the conversation. "Oh, Claire." Morgan's voice rang out, dripping with amusement. "Did you really think I'd include you in tonight's dinner?" I turned to see my mother-in-law standing just a few feet away, dressed in her usual designer ensemble, her platinum blonde hair perfectly styled. Seated behind her, my husband, Adam, sat stiffly, his gaze darting between us, clearly uncomfortable but saying nothing. Beside him, his sisters, Charlotte and Emma, whispered to each other, smirking. I felt my stomach twist, but I refused to let it show. "I don't understand," I said, my voice calm. Morgan's smile widened. "Oh, sweetheart, I didn't think you'd actually come." She chuckled as if I had done something amusing. "This is a family dinner. A place like this is... well, it's a bit out of your league, don't you think? Maybe a budget restaurant suits you better." Charlotte snickered behind her wine glass. Emma avoided my gaze. Adam... He just sat there, gripping his fork. Silent. I felt the weight of humiliation settle in, the judgment in the air thick enough to choke on. Other guests were beginning to notice, their curious glances flicking toward the unfolding drama. I should have seen this coming. For years, Morgan had made it abundantly clear that I was never good enough for her son. I didn't come from old money like she did. I didn't attend prestigious schools. I wasn't born into their privileged world. From the moment Adam and I got engaged, Morgan had gone out of her way to remind me that I didn't belong. At first, it was subtle. The passive-aggressive comments about my simple tastes, the way she would conveniently forget to invite me to family events, the expensive gifts she would buy for Adam while giving me nothing but empty smiles. But tonight she had taken things to a whole new level. She had planned this. She had arranged for my husband's family to have a luxurious dinner at one of the most exclusive restaurants in the city, ensuring I would be left standing at the entrance like an unwanted outsider. And she was enjoying every second of it. The humiliation should have burned. I should have felt small. But instead, something inside me clicked. I smiled. A slow, deliberate smile that made Morgan's expression falter for just a second. Then, without a word, I turned to the maitre d'. "Would you be so kind as to ask the owner to come out?" I asked, my voice smooth and confident. Morgan let out a laugh. "Oh, please. Do you really think the owner of this place is going to come out here just because you asked?" I turned back to her and met her gaze evenly. "Yes." "Because the owner of this restaurant?" He knew me very well. And in a few moments, my dear mother-in-law was about to learn a lesson she'd never forget. Morgan's smirk didn't waver, but I could see it. The slightest flicker of doubt in her eyes. She had spent years treating me like an outsider. But tonight, she had escalated her little game into outright humiliation. And she had done it in front of my husband, his sisters, and a restaurant full of people. The air around us felt thick, heavy with anticipation as I stood my ground, refusing to let her win. The maitre d' hesitated, clearly unsure whether to humor my request. But before he could respond, a deep voice cut through the tension. "Claire?" I turned just as Daniel Laurent, the owner of this exclusive establishment, stepped into view. A man in his early 50s, Daniel was the definition of refined elegance. Salt and pepper hair, a tailored suit, and the kind of confidence that came with owning one of the most sought-after restaurants in the city. Morgan's eyes widened slightly as she registered the way he looked at me. Not with dismissal, but with genuine warmth. "Daniel?" I greeted, my smile widening. "It's been a while." His gaze flickered over to Morgan, then to Adam and his sisters, before settling back on me. "It has. What brings you here tonight?" I gestured toward the table where my in-laws sat, their expressions shifting from amusement to something far more uncertain. Apparently, I wasn't included in the reservation, I said lightly. A bit of an oversight, wouldn't you say? Daniel's eyes darkened slightly, catching the unspoken subtext in my words. Then, just as quickly, a polite smile curved his lips. That won't do at all, Morgan scoffed, crossing her arms. Oh, please, do you really think this restaurant can just find a seat for her? This is a private dining establishment. You don't just walk in and expect a table. Daniel's expression remained unreadable. You're absolutely right, Mrs. Sinclair, he said smoothly. This restaurant does not accept last-minute walk-ins. I felt a pang of disappointment, but before I could respond, he turned toward the maître d'. But Claire is not a walk-in. She is family. The entire table froze. Charlotte's glass nearly slipped from her fingers. Emma's eyes darted between me and Daniel in shock. And Adam? His grip tightened on his silverware, but still he said nothing. Morgan, however, wasn't one to back down easily. She let out a disbelieving laugh. Family? Oh, this is rich. You must be mistaken. Claire is my son's wife, and I assure you she has no connections to… Actually, I interrupted smoothly. Daniel and I go way back. Morgan narrowed her eyes. How? I leaned forward slightly, my voice just loud enough for those at the nearby tables to overhear. Before I married Adam, I used to work in fine dining. And Daniel? He was my mentor. A stunned silence settled over the table. Morgan opened her mouth, likely to protest, but Daniel cut her off with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Claire isn't just some former employee, he said calmly. She trained under me when she was fresh out of culinary school. I personally taught her everything she knows about hospitality and high-end service. She was one of the best students I ever had. Morgan's jaw tightened. This was not going how she had planned. I could see the realization settling in. The fact that, despite all of her efforts to belittle me, I had a past she knew nothing about. A past that now undermined her entire stunt. And I wasn't finished. I turned to the maître d', still standing awkwardly at his podium. I assume Daniel's word is good enough to find me a seat? The maître d' immediately straightened. Of course, Miss Claire. I'll have the staff prepare a table right away. Morgan's face turned a shade of red I had never seen before. This is ridiculous, she hissed under her breath. You're telling me she gets special treatment just because she used to work for you? Daniel chuckled. No, she gets special treatment because she earned it. The maître d' signaled for a waiter, who hurried over and began setting a place at their table, right next to Adam. Oh, I mused, feigning surprise. Looks like there's actually plenty of room after all. Morgan's fingers curled into fists against the tablecloth. This is absurd. I leaned in just slightly, lowering my voice so that only she could hear. What's absurd is that you thought you could humiliate me and get away with it. Her nostrils flared. You're being dramatic. I shrugged. I'm just enjoying dinner with my family. Isn't that what you wanted? Before she could snap back, Daniel patted my shoulder. I'll have the chef send over something special for you, Claire. Morgan nearly choked. Something special? Daniel smiled. On the house, of course. Morgan was seething now, but there was nothing she could do. Adam, still silent, reached for his drink. But I caught the flicker of something in his expression. Was it relief? Embarrassment? Shame? I wasn't sure. But what I did know was that this dinner had just begun. And Morgan Sinclair? She was going to regret ever thinking I could be dismissed so easily. The waiter placed a freshly polished silver plate in front of me, followed by an elegant amuse-bouche. Something delicate, artfully arranged and entirely complimentary, courtesy of Daniel. Morgan's expression? Pure unfiltered rage. Oh, I murmured, picking up my fork and slicing through the dish with practiced ease. This looks incredible. I took a bite, savoring it. Not just the taste, but the deliciously tense silence that followed. Across the table, Charlotte and Emma exchanged wary glances. Adam still hadn't said a word. choosing instead to stare at his wine glass as if it held the answers to his problems. Morgan, however, wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. She took a slow sip of her own wine before placing the glass down with a little too much force. "Well," she said, forcing a tight smile, "I suppose it's only natural that someone like you would know people in hospitality." I arched a brow. "Hospitality?" Morgan waved a hand, feigning politeness. "You know, service industries, waiting tables, kitchen work. Not exactly the kind of careers we're accustomed to in this family." Ah, there it was. The real reason she had orchestrated this entire charade. It wasn't just about excluding me from dinner. It was about reminding me, in front of everyone, that in her eyes, I was still just a woman who had worked her way up from nothing. I took another sip of wine before responding. "You say that like it's a bad thing." Morgan's eyes flickered with something, annoyance, maybe even a bit of surprise. She had expected me to be rattled, but I wasn't. Not anymore. "I simply meant," she continued, "that it must have been quite an adjustment for you, marrying into a family like ours." Her tone was light, but the words dripped with condescension. And Adam, still, said nothing. I turned my gaze to him, studying the way he refused to meet my eyes. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't just about his mother's cruelty. This was about his silence. Because this wasn't the first time Morgan had tried to humiliate me. It had happened at our wedding, when she conveniently forgot to invite my side of the family to the rehearsal dinner. It had happened at Christmas, when she gifted me a cookbook titled "Simple Recipes for the Clueless Wife" in front of an entire room of people. It had happened last summer, when she made a snide remark about how fortunate I was that Adam had taken a chance on me. And every single time, Adam had let it slide. And I had told myself it wasn't worth fighting over, that I didn't want to be the cause of conflict. But this was different. This wasn't just a passive-aggressive comment. This was an orchestrated attempt to humiliate me in public. And he had let it happen. I set my wine glass down, the movement slow, deliberate. Then I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on the table. "Morgan," I said, my voice smooth, even. "Do you know what the difference is between you and me?" She tilted her head, curiosity flickering in her eyes despite herself. I smiled. "I worked for everything I have." A sharp, stunned silence fell over the table. Morgan's face hardened. "Excuse me?" I didn't blink. "You heard me?" I felt Charlotte stiffen beside her mother. Emma pressed her lips together as if suppressing a laugh. Morgan scoffed. "Are you trying to imply that I haven't worked for what I have?" I let the question hang in the air. And then, before she could formulate another condescending response, I added, "I didn't marry into wealth. I didn't inherit status. I built my career from the ground up. And yet," I gestured at the table. "Here we are, sitting at the same restaurant, eating the same food, with the same level of respect from the owner." Morgan's fingers curled around her napkin, knuckles white. Charlotte and Emma weren't laughing anymore. And Adam? He looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. For the first time since I had met Morgan, I saw something flicker across her face. Something she usually hid too well. It wasn't anger. It was fear. Because she had spent years trying to convince herself that I didn't belong, that I was lesser, that I was just some gold digger who had latched onto her son. But now she was starting to realize the truth. And the truth was that I was not someone she could break. I picked up my fork, casually cutting into my dish again. "Oh, and Morgan?" She exhaled sharply through her nose, clearly furious that I had stolen control of the conversation. "What?" I smiled, slow and deliberate. "You should be careful about who you look down on." I speared a bite of food and placed it in my mouth, chewing slowly before adding, "You never know who might end up above you." The tension at the table was suffocating. Morgan, usually poised and in complete control, sat stone-faced, her fingers curled so tightly around her wine glass that I half expected it to shatter. Adam looked like he wanted to disappear into his seat. Charlotte and Emma were stealing glances at each other, clearly wondering if they should intervene. And me? I had never felt more certain of my place. I could see it in Morgan's expression, the way her carefully curated mask of superiority had cracked, even if just for a moment. She wasn't used to being challenged. She had built her power on people bending to her will, on people being too afraid or too polite to put her in her place. But I wasn't afraid of her anymore. Morgan took a slow breath, composing herself before placing her glass down with a soft but deliberate click. "I see," she said finally, her voice deceptively smooth. "I suppose I should commend you, Claire. You've managed to elevate yourself beyond your circumstances." I took another sip of my wine, not giving her the satisfaction of a reaction. "But tell me," she continued, her lips curving into a saccharine smile, "if you're so independent, so self-made, why is it that my son is the one paying for your lifestyle?" I paused. Charlotte let out a quiet gasp. Emma shifted uncomfortably. "And Adam?" Adam flinched. Morgan's smile sharpened. She could feel the eyes of the table on me now, waiting for a response. I set my glass down, my movements slow and deliberate. "What do you mean by that?" I asked, feigning confusion. Morgan leaned forward, dropping her voice to a mocking whisper. "I mean, darling, that my son is the reason you can afford that lovely little boutique job of yours, isn't he? You don't actually need to work, yet you play pretend at having a career. How charming." She tilted her head, her smug smile returning. "You talk about self-sufficiency, but at the end of the day, you're still just someone my son supports." And there it was, her final card. The insult meant to humiliate me beyond recovery. The final blow to put me back in my place. I let the words settle, taking in the way Adam still refused to look at me. The way his sisters held their breath, waiting for me to crumble. And then I laughed. Not a small, embarrassed chuckle, a full, genuine laugh. Morgan's smirk faltered. "I'm sorry, is something funny?" I placed my napkin back onto the table, still chuckling. "I just realized how truly out of touch you are, Morgan." Her eyes narrowed. "Excuse me?" I gestured toward Adam, my voice calm and deliberate. "You think he supports me?" I asked, arching a brow. "That's adorable." Charlotte made a choking sound. Emma's lips parted in shock. "And Adam?" Adam went pale. Morgan's smile dropped instantly. "What are you talking about?" I sighed, almost pitying her. "You still see Adam as your little boy, don't you? The one in control, the provider, the man who rescued me from my lowly life." I tilted my head. "But let me tell you something, Morgan. That's not how this marriage works." Morgan stiffened. "You want to know what's funny?" I continued. "Adam's business, his investment projects, half of them were funded with my money." A stunned silence fell over the table. Morgan's eyes widened, her entire world shifting in real time. What?" she whispered. I smiled, but this time there was no warmth in it. "Adam didn't build his career alone," I continued, still speaking to her but keeping my gaze locked on my husband. "When he wanted to start investing, he didn't have the capital." I picked up my wine glass again. "But I did." Morgan's fingers twitched. "That's not possible." I shrugged. "Believe what you want. But the reality is, your son's success is built on my investments, my strategies, and my support." Charlotte and Emma looked at Adam for confirmation. But Adam, still silent, still frozen in place. I shook my head. "You think you can humiliate me by painting me as some dependent little housewife?" That's laughable. Because the truth, Morgan? Adam needs me far more than I need him. Morgan's face turned a deep shade of red. I leaned back, crossing my arms. "You spent all these years trying to make me feel like I don't belong. But I've been the one keeping this marriage, and by extension, your precious family name, afloat. Emma looked like she was about to pass out. Charlotte? Completely speechless. And Adam? Adam finally opened his mouth. Claire, he croaked. Maybe we should... I held up a hand, cutting him off. No, Adam, I said, my voice firm. You don't get to, maybe we should me right now. Not after you sat here in silence while your mother tried to humiliate me. Morgan looked at him now, realizing for the first time that her son, her golden boy, was completely spineless. And suddenly, she didn't look as proud of him anymore. For the first time, she looked at him like he was small, like he was beneath her expectations, like he had failed her. A delicious role reversal. I stood up, smoothing down my dress. I think I'm done here. Morgan's nostrils flared. You can't just... I turned to Daniel, who had been watching from a polite distance. Daniel, it was lovely seeing you. Thank you for the hospitality. Daniel nodded, amused. Always a pleasure, Claire. Then I looked at Adam. You coming? He hesitated, staring at me, then at his mother. And in that moment, I knew. I knew exactly what he was going to do. Because Adam had never chosen me before. And he wasn't about to start now. Morgan smiled, triumphant. And I? I smiled right back. Because what she didn't know was, I had already made my choice too. And soon, she was going to regret ever trying to put me in my place. Because I was about to show her and Adam exactly how powerful I really was. Adam didn't follow me. I hadn't expected him to. As I stepped outside the restaurant, the cool night air brushed against my skin, but I barely felt it. My mind was sharp, clear. This dinner had been a long overdue wake-up call, a moment of truth that had been years in the making. And now, it was time to act. I pulled out my phone, my fingers steady as I typed a message. Me. We're moving forward. Initiate the process first thing tomorrow. Within seconds, the response came. Attorney. Understood. You'll have the first draft of the divorce settlement by noon. I exhaled slowly, staring at the screen. Divorce. The word didn't scare me. What scared me was how long I had ignored the truth. That Adam had never been on my side. That for years I had been alone in my own marriage. But not anymore. Tonight had been the final push I needed. And Morgan? She had no idea just how thoroughly I was about to upend the life she had worked so hard to control. I arrived home before Adam, which gave me just enough time to do what needed to be done. First, I walked into the home office, the one that Adam used for his investments. And I opened the safe. The passcode? He had never changed it. A mistake. Inside were all the financial documents, bank statements, investment portfolios, business agreements, and the one I was most interested in. The contract that tied his most lucrative investment to my initial funding. I picked it up, scanning the familiar legal jargon. This was the document that proved I was the financial backbone of his entire empire. Morgan thought her son was the great businessman of the family. But without me, he was nothing. I took a quick photo of the contract, then placed it back exactly where I found it. There was no need to take it, not when I already had what I needed. Next, I went to the bedroom. I pulled out a suitcase and began packing. Not in anger, not in haste, but in absolute clarity. This wasn't an emotional decision. This was a calculated departure. By the time Adam walked through the front door, I was sitting on the couch, suitcase by my side, waiting. He paused in the doorway, staring at me like he wasn't sure if he had come home to the right house. Claire? I tilted my head. Took you long enough. His eyes darted to the suitcase, his breath catching. What are you doing? I stood up, calm and controlled. Leaving. Adam's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. You made your choice, Adam, I said smoothly. Back there at the restaurant. When your mother humiliated me, again, and you just sat there. His jaw tensed. I was trying to keep the peace. I laughed. Peace? Adam, your mother planned this entire dinner to embarrass me. She booked a table and left me off the reservation on purpose. She insulted me. She tried to make me feel like I didn't belong. I stepped closer, watching him shrink slightly under my gaze. And you let her. Just like you always do. He rubbed the back of his neck, clearly flustered. It's complicated, Claire. You know how she is. I let out a breath. No, Adam. It's simple. You're weak. His eyes snapped to mine, offended. But it was the truth. You've spent our entire marriage letting your mother dictate how you treat me. I was patient, Adam. I gave you so many chances. But tonight? I shook my head. Tonight, I finally saw you for what you are. Adam swallowed hard. Claire, let's just talk about this. I sighed. That's the problem, Adam. There's nothing left to talk about. I picked up my suitcase and brushed past him. And then, just as I reached the door, I'll fight you on this. I turned. What? Adam's face had darkened, his voice low. If you think you're walking away from this marriage with half of everything, you're mistaken. I stared at him for a moment before smiling. Oh, Adam, I said softly. You really should read your own contracts more carefully. Confusion flickered across his face. What? I cut him off. You wouldn't even have half of what you own if it weren't for me. You used my money to build your investments. And guess what? I let the moment hang. I have all the paperwork to prove it. His face drained of color. I stepped closer, lowering my voice. I let you borrow my money, Adam. I let you build something with it. But now? I smiled. Now I want it back. Adam staggered back a step, the reality hitting him all at once. He thought he could threaten me? He had no idea who he was dealing with. Adam stood frozen in the doorway, his face pale, his jaw clenched. I could see the exact moment the realization hit him. That I wasn't just leaving him. I was taking everything he thought he controlled. He opened his mouth, probably to argue, to beg, to try and manipulate me like he always had. But I didn't give him the chance. I'll be staying at the penthouse, I said, adjusting the strap of my bag over my shoulder. His brows furrowed. What penthouse? I smiled, tilting my head slightly. Oh, Adam, the one you think you own. I watched as confusion turned into horror. The downtown penthouse? He asked, voice uneven. The one I bought under my name? Yes, I said smoothly. I had my lawyer review the ownership documents earlier today. It was never yours, Adam. His nostrils flared. You wouldn't... I already did. I reached into my bag and pulled out an envelope, tossing it onto the counter. He hesitated before opening it, his eyes skimming over the legal document inside. His hands shook. This... He swallowed. This says you own 51% of my investment firm. I nodded. Correct? His breathing turned shallow. That's impossible. I shrugged. Not really. I was the initial investor, remember? I never transferred ownership over to you. You just assumed I did because, well, you never actually read the contracts, did you? I watched as panic took over his features, his mind racing, probably wondering how the hell he had let this happen. Claire, he said, voice tight, you can't just take this from me. I smiled. I'm not taking anything. I already own it. He staggered back, gripping the counter. This was the man who had let his mother humiliate me, who had sat there in cowardly silence while she tried to strip me of my dignity. Now he was the one powerless. I don't understand, he muttered. Why? Why are you doing this? And for the first time in years, I felt completely, undeniably free. Because Adam, I said, I finally see my worth. And with that, I turned and walked out of the house, for the last time. A month later, I sat in the penthouse, legs crossed, a glass of champagne in my hand. Across from me, my attorney smiled as she slid the finalized divorce papers toward me. "It's official. You're free." I exhaled slowly, running my fingers over the thick paper. Free. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind. The legal battle? Short and brutal. Adam had tried to fight, of course. He had stormed into meetings, demanded a better deal, threatened to take me to court. But the moment my lawyers laid out the documents proving I was the true majority shareholder in his firm, his arrogance had collapsed. Morgan had tried to intervene. She had called me, furious, accusing me of being a gold-digging snake. I had simply responded, "If you raised him better, this wouldn't have happened." And then, I blocked her number, because Morgan Sinclair was no longer my problem. I lifted the champagne glass to my lips, savoring the moment. And then, as if the universe wanted to gift me one last laugh, my phone buzzed. "Adam, can we talk?" I smirked, setting the glass down and typing back. "Me. About what?" A pause. Then, "Adam, I don't know what to do." I exhaled, shaking my head. It was sad, really. For years, I had waited for Adam to show up for me, to be the man I thought I married. I had waited for him to stand up to his mother, to fight for me the way I had fought for him. But now I saw him for exactly what he was. A man who had spent his life hiding behind the power of others, too weak to build anything on his own. And the irony? He needed me now more than ever. But I didn't need him at all. I typed one final message. "Me. That's not my problem anymore." Then I blocked his number too, because for the first time in my life, I was choosing myself. And that was the most powerful thing I had ever done.
After 12 years of running my father's company, I finally made it worth $75 million. At a family dinner, my dad looked at me and said, smiling, "Your brother will take over now." My heart sank, but I smiled back. The next morning at work changed everything. I still remember the way my father smiled that night, his hand resting proudly on my brother's shoulder, as if he had already made up his mind long before speaking the words that would change everything. "Your brother will take over now." I felt my stomach drop, but years of practice kept my face composed. I smiled back, as if his words didn't pierce straight through me, as if they weren't unraveling 12 years of my life's work in an instant. The dining room was filled with the clinking of glasses, the quiet hum of conversations between extended family and close business associates. This wasn't just a family dinner, it was a celebration, a moment meant to honor everything we had built, everything I had built. My father had started Harper & Company when I was just a child, a modest logistics business that barely stayed afloat in its early years. I grew up watching him struggle to keep it alive, working late nights, sacrificing family vacations, always chasing one more contract to make ends meet. When I was 24, fresh out of business school, he finally let me step in, though I had to fight for that opportunity. And I had done more than just step in. I had transformed Harper & Company from a struggling regional logistics firm into a national powerhouse, expanding operations, securing million-dollar contracts, integrating cutting-edge technology. What was once a small, nearly bankrupt company now stood as an industry leader worth $75 million. And yet, in this moment, none of it mattered. My father had already decided. My brother, Ethan, would be taking over, not me. A slow ripple of approval spread around the table, murmurs of congratulations directed at Ethan. I watched as he lowered his gaze, feigning modesty, though I knew better. Ethan had never been truly invested in the business. He had spent the last decade hopping from one failed venture to another, never quite finding his footing. He wasn't interested in logistics. He wasn't interested in operations. But he was interested in power. I had spent 12 years proving myself, building Harper & Company from the ground up, making every hard decision, every late-night strategy call, every contract negotiation. Ethan had done none of it. And yet, here we were. Still, I swallowed my emotions. I had learned long ago that in this family, showing pain was weakness. I reached for my wine glass, steadying my hand before lifting it. "Smile, Lisa, smile." "To Ethan," I said, my voice smooth, controlled. The guests raised their glasses, oblivious to the storm brewing behind my eyes. My mother cast me a glance from across the table, an unreadable expression, but I knew she understood. Unlike my father, she had always seen the effort I put in, but she wouldn't interfere. She never did. Then there was my father, grinning with that same unwavering confidence, completely unaware that his choice had set something in motion. Ethan met my gaze from across the table, a smirk barely hidden at the corner of his lips. That was the moment I knew. This wasn't just my father's decision. Ethan had been waiting for this. He had positioned himself carefully, playing the role of the dutiful son who had finally found his calling. And my father, ever the traditionalist, saw no flaw in his logic. A son should inherit the empire. A daughter, well, a daughter's efforts were always considered temporary. A footnote in history, no matter how hard she fought to prove otherwise. But what they didn't realize, what neither of them had accounted for, was that I had spent 12 years not just building a company, but fortifying my position within it. And tomorrow morning, they would learn exactly what that meant. That night, I barely slept. My mind replayed every sacrifice I had made for Harper and Company. The late nights, the missed birthdays, the relationships that crumbled under the weight of my ambition. I had given everything for this company, and now they expected me to simply step aside? They had underestimated me. By 3 a.m., I was in my home office, my fingers moving quickly across my keyboard. Every contract, every share, every executive agreement. I knew the inner workings of this company better than anyone. Ethan thought he was walking into an easy transition, that by next week, his name would be on the office door, his position secured. What he didn't know was that while my father had been busy with public appearances, and my brother had been busy pretending to learn the business, I had been securing something far more valuable: control. At exactly 8:45 a.m., I stepped into Harper & Company headquarters, just like I had for the past 12 years. The same walls, the same polished floors, the same hum of efficiency as employees settled into their routines. But today was different. Today, I wasn't walking into my office. I was walking into a battlefield. The reception area was unusually quiet, the kind of quiet that precedes a storm. They knew. The whispers had already started. The news of my father's announcement at dinner had spread like wildfire. Employees glanced at me with hesitant expressions, avoiding direct eye contact, unsure of where their loyalty should lie. I didn't acknowledge them. I walked with confidence, my heels clicking against the marble floors, my posture unwavering. Never let them see you shaken. I entered my office, shutting the door behind me. I had precisely 15 minutes before my father and Ethan arrived, thinking they would step into their new positions as CEO and heir apparent. 15 minutes before everything they had planned crumbled in front of them. I sat at my desk, inhaling deeply, then powered on my computer. The screen illuminated with a list of confidential documents and contracts, ones they had never thought to look at, ones they had assumed didn't matter. I pulled up my ownership records. My hands hovered over the keyboard for a second before I clicked on the file labeled Executive Shareholders Agreement. And then I waited. At precisely 9 a.m., there was a sharp knock at my door. I didn't bother responding. The door swung open, and in walked my father and Ethan, both exuding confidence. His inborn, Ethan's carefully manufactured. My father strode in like a king surveying his kingdom, while Ethan, dressed in an expensive navy suit, gave me a smug, triumphant grin. It took everything in me not to laugh. "Lisa," my father said, in his usual authoritative voice, as if he were doing me a favor by acknowledging me. I assume you're aware of the transition happening today? Transition. Interesting choice of words. I'm aware, I said smoothly, leaning back in my chair. I glanced at Ethan, whose smirk only widened. Good, my father continued, nodding as if we were all in agreement. Ethan will be stepping in as the new CEO. We'll need you to help with the handover. Get him familiar with the operations before you officially move on. I arched an eyebrow. Move on? I echoed, feigning confusion. Dad, I think you're mistaken about something. His face twitched in irritation. He was used to my compliance, my ability to quietly fall in line. He wasn't prepared for this. Lisa, he said, voice tight, as if speaking to a child. This isn't up for debate. We've already made the decision. I smiled then, a slow, knowing smile. Oh, I know, Dad, I said softly. The thing is, you don't have the authority to make that decision. Ethan let out a low scoff, shaking his head. Lisa, don't make this difficult. We're trying to do this the easy way. I didn't respond. Instead, I reached for the remote control and pressed a button. The large screen on my office wall lit up with a document, the same one I had been reviewing earlier. Executive Shareholders Agreement, signed. August 17th, 2015, signatories. Lisa Harper, James Harper, father, Ethan Harper. My father's face paled slightly. I turned to Ethan. Do you even know what this document is? He crossed his arms, shifting in discomfort. A shareholders agreement? He guessed. I nodded. Yes. And do you know what it says? I tapped the screen, highlighting a crucial clause. This document was drafted when Harper & Company was restructuring. It clearly states that any transfer of executive power, such as appointing a new CEO, requires the approval of all majority shareholders. I met my father's eyes. And I, Dad, hold 60% of the company's shares. The silence that followed was suffocating. My father's expression hardened. That's impossible, Ethan muttered, stepping forward to examine the document. Actually, it's very possible, I said smoothly. You see, over the years, while you were busy failing at every startup you touched, and Dad was busy playing the role of business patriarch, I was doing something else. I leaned forward. I was securing my place. I turned back to my father. Remember when you needed capital for expansion in 2017? You signed over an additional 15% of your shares to me in exchange for my investment. And in 2019, when we had that legal battle, another 10% was transferred under my name as collateral, which you never bothered reclaiming. That, plus my original 35%, makes me the majority shareholder. My father's jaw clenched, but Ethan was panicking. You have to be bluffing, he spat. I pulled out a second document. This is the most recent legal filing with the state. Want to verify? Ethan snatched the paper and scanned it, his face draining of color with each passing second. You can't do this, he stammered. Dad, tell her she can't do this. My father remained silent, because he knew. I had legally outmaneuvered him, and there was nothing he could do about it. I exhaled slowly, standing up. I'm not firing you, Ethan, I said. I wouldn't want to force you into the real job market, but you will report to me, and you will work under my leadership. Otherwise, I gestured toward the door. You're free to leave. Ethan turned to my father, eyes pleading. But for the first time in his life, my father had no answer. No way to fix this, because this wasn't his company anymore. It was mine. The silence in my office was suffocating. Ethan still clutched the legal document in his hand, his fingers white from gripping it too tightly. My father stood rigid beside him, his expression unreadable, but I knew better. He was calculating, trying to find a way out of this. There wasn't one. I had spent years preparing for this moment. Not because I had expected betrayal, but because experience had taught me never to assume loyalty where power was involved. For the first time in my life, my father looked at me as if he didn't recognize me. Perhaps he never had. So that's it? Ethan finally spoke, his voice laced with bitterness. "You're just taking everything?" I let out a soft, humorless laugh. "Taking everything?" I repeated, stepping closer to him. "Ethan, I built this company from nothing. Every contract, every expansion, every innovation, I made it happen. While you were busy failing upwards, I was keeping this company alive. So no, I'm not taking anything." I leaned in slightly. "I'm just keeping what's already mine." Ethan's face twisted in anger, but he had no rebuttal. He knew I was right. And worse, so did my father. He had spent years believing that bloodline mattered more than ability, that his son would inherit what was rightfully mine. He had underestimated me, and now he was paying for that mistake. My father finally broke the silence. "You're making a mistake, Lisa." His voice was calm, measured, but I could hear the strain underneath. "A family should stick together. Do you really want to burn this bridge?" I met his gaze head-on. "Dad," I said slowly, "you burned this bridge the moment you made your decision without me." His lips pressed into a thin line. "Business is bigger than just one person. We can find a solution that works for everyone." I tilted my head slightly, feigning consideration. "Oh, I agree. That's why I'm offering you both a choice." I turned to Ethan first. "You can stay in the company," I said, keeping my voice smooth, professional. "But you won't be CEO. You'll take on an advisory role with limited authority. Your salary will be generous, but you will answer to me." Ethan stiffened, but I didn't stop. "Or," I continued, "you can walk away. I'll buy out your shares at market value. You can take the money and find a new project to sink your teeth into." My father scoffed. "You're acting like you hold all the cards." I smiled. "I do." A thick silence followed my words. I let them sit in it, let them feel what it was like to be powerless. Finally, my father exhaled, shaking his head as if in disbelief. "I never thought you'd do this," he muttered. "Not to your own family." I felt a sharp pang at his words. Not to your own family. I wanted to tell him that he was the one who had done this, that he had made the choice to push me aside, to act as if I was temporary. But I didn't, because in the end, it didn't matter. What mattered was that I wasn't going to let them take what I had built. Not now, not ever. Ethan stormed out first. Good riddance. I knew my brother well enough to predict his next move. He would go to our relatives, our family friends, painting himself as the victim of corporate betrayal. I didn't care. I wasn't here to win their approval. I was here to win my future. My father lingered for a moment longer, as if waiting for me to change my mind. When I didn't, he gave a slow nod. "You've changed," he said quietly. I met his gaze. "No, Dad. I just finally stopped pretending." Then he left. I exhaled, sitting back down in my chair. I should have felt victorious. I had fought for my place and won. But as I stared at the empty doorway, I felt something else too. A quiet, lingering ache. A part of me had always wanted my father's approval. Some small, desperate part of me had thought that if I worked hard enough, if I proved myself over and over again, he would finally see me. But the truth was, he had never really looked. And now? Now he had no choice but to see me for what I really was. Not his daughter, not his temporary stand-in. The true leader of Harper & Company. I turned back to my computer, my focus shifting. I had spent 12 years building this company. Now I would spend the next 12 making it untouchable. My father and brother had tried to take everything from me, but in the end, they were the ones who lost everything. For the first time in 12 years, my office felt empty. No phone calls from my father, no passive-aggressive emails from Ethan, just silence. But silence didn't mean peace. It meant the battle had begun. I knew my father wouldn't walk away quietly. And Ethan? He would fight tooth and nail to reclaim what he thought was his birthright. I wasn't naive enough to think this was over. It had just begun. By the next morning, I could already feel the undercurrent of unease within the company. Employees who had greeted me with confidence last week now seemed hesitant, as if afraid to pick a side. A few department heads avoided eye contact. I knew what was happening. My father and Ethan were working the Whisper Network. Old family friends, board members, senior executives. They were sowing doubt, painting me as cold, ruthless, disloyal. Ethan, especially, had taken on the role of the wounded son, betrayed by his own sister. I could imagine him now, sitting in some high-end restaurant, fake sorrow in his voice, as he told our investors how I had stolen the company out from under him. And my father? He wouldn't need to say much at all. Just a heavy sigh, a shaking head, the carefully placed words, "I only ever wanted the best for my children." It was calculated and dangerous, because if they managed to turn my board members and top executives against me, they could push me out of my own company, or at least make my leadership impossible. I wasn't about to let that happen. That afternoon, I called an emergency executive meeting. As I stepped into the boardroom, I felt the tension in the air. Half of the room avoided my gaze. The other half watched me too closely, waiting for me to slip. I took my seat at the head of the table. My seat. "Let's not waste time," I said, my voice even. I know there have been conversations, behind closed doors, over drinks, in hushed voices. I let my eyes scan the room, pausing on each person for just long enough to make them shift uncomfortably. I also know that some of you are wondering if my leadership is sustainable. A few people tensed. No one spoke. I tapped my fingers against the polished wood table. Let's clear that up now. I pulled up a presentation on the screen behind me. Numbers, data, facts. I built this company from a struggling regional business to a $75 million industry leader. Over the last 5 years, under my leadership, we've seen a 300% increase in revenue and expanded into 6 new markets. I turned to the CFO. "Paul, do we have a single financial indicator suggesting this company is in trouble under my leadership?" Paul hesitated, then shook his head. "Number. In fact, projections show another 20% growth in the next quarter." I nodded. "So let's be honest about what's happening here." I leaned forward. My father and brother aren't upset because the company is struggling. They aren't upset because I'm failing as a leader. They're upset because they expected me to step aside and let Ethan take over, regardless of qualifications, regardless of results. The room was silent. Then I dropped the real bomb. I also know that some of you have been contacted in the last 24 hours, offered incentives to push for my resignation. I tilted my head slightly. If anyone here would like to disclose those conversations now, this is your chance. A few people shifted uncomfortably. Then, after a long pause, one of the senior executives cleared his throat. "I received a call," he admitted, "from your father. He said he was considering making an official appeal to the board." I nodded, unsurprised. "And did he offer anything in return for your support?" A pause, then a slow nod. "There it is." I exhaled, standing up. "My father built this company," I said. "I won't discredit that, but I took it further than he ever could have, and I will not allow him to manipulate it from the outside." I let my voice drop slightly. Controlled. Dangerous. If he wants a fight, he'll get one. I gathered my papers, looking at each executive in the eye. If anyone here believes my father and brother deserve control, now is the time to make your move. Silence. No one moved. Good. I turned and walked out, my head held high. This wasn't just about keeping my company. This was about making sure they never thought they could take it from me again. That night, I made my own call. Not to a board member, not to an investor, but to the media. By morning, the business section of every major news outlet had the same headline: "Power Shift at Harper & Co. Lisa Harper outmaneuvers family in boardroom battle." I had made my move. Now it was their turn. And I was waiting. The morning after my story hit the press, my inbox exploded. Emails, missed calls, messages from journalists, investors, and board members. Some were supportive, some were cautious. but most of them had one question in common. Is it true? I let them wait. I knew the game my father was playing. He had spent decades perfecting the art of public perception. He knew that reputation held weight in business. If he couldn't defeat me in the boardroom, he would undermine me in the public eye. And that was exactly what he was trying to do. By noon, the first counterattack arrived. A press release, neatly crafted, carefully worded, but filled with lies. Harper & Company has always been a family-run business. We are saddened by recent developments, but remain committed to upholding the values that built this company. Changes in leadership are inevitable, and we hope to transition smoothly as we move forward. It was subtle, but I knew what it was really saying. Lisa is reckless. Lisa is unstable. Lisa is not a team player. I wasn't surprised. I was, however, pissed. I sat in my office, watching the news as industry analysts debated my leadership. Was Lisa Harper too aggressive in her takeover? Will her lack of cooperation hurt the company in the long run? Can she recover from this PR disaster? They talked as if I wasn't watching, as if I wasn't already planning my next move. Because if my father and Ethan wanted a public war, I was going to give them one. I didn't release a statement. I didn't call a press conference. Instead, I made one phone call. To an old friend in investigative journalism. I have something for you, I said, but you'll need to move fast. An hour later, I sent over documents, emails, financial reports, internal records, evidence that Harper & Company, under my father's leadership, had engaged in questionable business practices over the years, ones I had spent the last decade quietly cleaning up. The story broke within 24 hours. Behind the scenes at Harper & Company, a legacy of hidden debts and financial cover-ups. The article was brutal. It praised my leadership for fixing the company's financial health. It criticized my father's mismanagement from the past. And most importantly, it proved that I was the only reason Harper & Company had survived. And just like that, the narrative changed. The board stopped doubting me. The investors stopped hesitating. And my father? He had nowhere to hide. 2 days later, my father finally called me. I let the phone ring 3 times before answering. "Lisa," he said, his voice tight, "we need to talk." I leaned back in my chair. "Do we?" Silence. Then, finally, a sigh. "You didn't have to do that." I let out a small laugh. "Neither did you." "This company was supposed to be a legacy," he said. "For the family, for both of you." I felt a familiar pang. A tiny, foolish part of me had once wanted that too, but not anymore. "Dad," I said quietly, "if you wanted me to protect the legacy, you should have trusted me with it. Instead, you tried to take it from me." Another long silence. Then he asked, almost reluctantly, "What happens now?" I exhaled slowly. Now I made sure they could never touch my company again. The war was over. My father had lost. Ethan had disappeared. And I had won. But as I sat in my office, staring out over the city skyline, I felt no satisfaction, no triumph, just emptiness. I had spent 12 years fighting for Harper & Company, building it, protecting it, making it stronger than ever before. And yet, the cost of that victory weighed heavier than I had expected. Because while I had secured my position, I had lost something else along the way. My family. The next day, I walked into the office as if nothing had changed. But everyone knew the truth. The whispers had stopped. The doubt had faded. I was no longer just Lisa Harper, the CEO. I was Lisa Harper, the woman who had outmaneuvered her father and brother and come out on top. Some respected me for it. Some feared me for it. And some still waited for me to fall. I let them wait. At noon, my father and I met in the conference room for what would be our final discussion. He looked tired, older, as if the weight of what had happened had finally settled on his shoulders. I waited for him to speak first. When he finally did, his voice was quieter than I had ever heard it. "I'm retiring," he said simply. Effective immediately. I didn't react. I had expected this. I'll sell my remaining shares, he continued. I'll keep a small percentage as an investor, but I won't be involved anymore. I studied him carefully. And Ethan? His jaw tightened. He's gone, my father admitted. Took the buyout. He won't be back. A part of me had known it would end this way. Ethan had never been strong enough to fight his own battles. Once it was clear he had lost, he had done what he always did. Run. Still, hearing it out loud made something inside me ache. Not regret, not guilt, just the finality of it all. I nodded. Understood. My father exhaled, rubbing his temple as if he had a headache. Then, after a long pause, he said something I never expected. I underestimated you. It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest thing I would ever get. And strangely, I found that I didn't need it anymore. A month later, Harper & Company looked nothing like it had before. The old board members who had aligned themselves with my father and Ethan, gone. The executives who had questioned my leadership, replaced. The company had always been strong under my guidance, but now it was truly mine. And with that control came a new vision. I introduced initiatives my father had always rejected. Modernized systems he had called unnecessary. Expanded into industries he had been too cautious to explore. Within 6 months, profits soared. Within a year, we had crossed the $100 million mark. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't just fighting to prove myself. I was fighting to build something that no one could ever take from me again. A year after everything had happened, I met my father for dinner. It was the first time we had spoken since his retirement. He looked different, quieter. He wasn't angry anymore, just accepting. I read about the latest deal you closed, he said over his drink. It was a smart move. I smirked slightly. I know. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. There was no tension between us anymore. No war left to fight. Only the simple, undeniable truth. He had tried to push me aside, and I had proved him wrong. He lifted his glass. To Harper & Company, he said. This time, when I clinked my glass against his, I didn't feel anger or resentment, only peace, because I had already won, and I no longer needed his approval to know it. As I sit in my office today, overlooking the city that I built my empire in, I think about the lessons this journey has taught me. That family can be your biggest enemy. That loyalty is a currency, not a guarantee. That power is never given, it's taken. But most importantly, that sometimes the best way to prove your worth is to stop seeking validation and build something so strong that they can never ignore you again. I have no regrets. Harper & Company is mine now, and I intend to make sure no one ever forgets it.
I never imagined my own parents would one day look me in the eye and tell me my children weren't welcome in their home. Yet, there I was, standing in my kitchen, staring at my phone in disbelief. Thanksgiving was just a few weeks away, and my mom's voice was unusually light as she spoke. Honey, we need to talk about Thanksgiving this year. My heart warmed for a moment. For all the tension that had existed between us over the years, I still longed for these family traditions. My kids, Emma and Lucas, adored their grandparents despite the distance that had formed. Of course, Mom. What's the plan? I asked, already picturing the way their house would be filled with the smell of roasted turkey, cinnamon, and the warmth of a family gathering. There was a brief pause, just long enough to send a chill down my spine. Well, Mom continued, clearing her throat. This year, we're doing things a little differently. It's going to be a smaller dinner. Just adults, something more intimate.